In this video, I will be comparing the Akkadian language with the Hebrew language. How similar are these two languages? You may have seen me do this before with Arabic, and now it's Hebrew's turn. And I'm going to follow basically the same format. There are numerous words, numerous vocabulary words that are shared between the two languages. And of course, they take their own forms in each language. So a chair, kusu in Akkadian, is going to be a kisei in Hebrew. To repeat something is shanu, which we have in Hebrew as shana. And then there will be minor switches or shifts. So you'll notice for the verb to depart, in Akkadian, we have wasu, and in Hebrew, yatsa. And that shift there is a W to Y shift. I mentioned it in the Arabic Akkadian video I did earlier when I was talking about waladu, which of course in Hebrew would be yeled or yalad as a verb. Something similar is happening here. When we see a W in either Arabic or Akkadian, it's going to be a W. Well, I guess it's Akkadian. It's just a W, since it isn't a wow. There isn't a wow in the cuneiform characters. But in Hebrew, it will be a yod rather than a vav or a wow. So Aramaic and Hebrew both have this shift from W to Y. Similarly, we see other words such as eretz in Hebrew as ertzetu in Akkadian. There's really a good deal of common vocabulary between the two languages, Akkadian and Hebrew, and it's not surprising. In fact, it very much parallels sort of, I would say, the same numerical commonality that Akkadian shares with Arabic. Well, what about related terms? In Akkadian, we have this word shadu, meaning a mountain or a mountain region. In Hebrew, we have something similar. We have sadeh, a field. So how are they related? Well, generally, the idea is the steppe or that region that's kind of far off and far away. If you think about it geographically, what is that region far away? Well, for the Akkadian speakers living in Mesopotamia who could, at some points see mountain ranges or look far off and encounter mountains, you would take that same far off steppe idea and apply it to a region like the Holy Land, where Hebrew is spoken, and you will have something like fields. Now, I'm just going to be quick with this slide since I did it last time with the Arabic video. Just keep in mind when I do these theoretical versions with cognates, I mean, they come across really weird. It's not how people talk, but I do it to showcase the range of cognates and if a similar sentence could theoretically be constructed. Whereas comparing one of Hammurabi's laws, that was Law Code 14, Shuma awilim mar awilim sechram ishtarik iddak. If a citizen steals the young son of a citizen, he shall be smitten. Which in modern Hebrew would yield im gonev ishet beno hakatan shel re'ehu yumat. Now that's an interesting one, and I'm comparing it here with Exodus 21:16, which you see here. So the modern Hebrew is just a translation of Hammurabi. The biblical version, it's not quite the same, but it has some of the same elements, right? If a man steals him and he's found in his possession, he shall surely die. So there's certain the fun thing with the Code of Hammurabi and even other law codes from the ancient Near East is you can compare them to biblical law, and you get these interesting conversations that happen where there's similarities and differences. I took this a step further out of the modern context and swapped some biblical Hebrew terms that would be cognate, and it comes off real weird. And I'm not sure how to do some of this, so bear with me. And in fact, if you have your own thoughts, leave them in the comments. So we could say something like im gonev ul or awel et beno shel awul hatzair yuddak. Now, that's interesting. Of course, we've discussed in the Arabic video how shumma and in, the Fusha version of if, compares. And here we see a little more direct comparison between im and shimma. Which just has an enclitic ma at the end. Then we have this term in Hebrew, ul, represented by the first version, the one that's not in parentheses. And it means something like a noble, which that seems to pair well with the Akkadian. I think in Kings, one of the books of Kings, maybe Second Kings, it says Ule, the nobles of something. The alternative is Awil or Avil, which, depending on your pronunciation, which would mean a fool. So part of me wonders if the word for fool in biblical Hebrew is only secondarily understood as fool, and instead is taking this class or this Mesopotamian group of people and sort of sending it up, reinterpreting the term, as a foolish group of people, kind of like saying, what would we say, the elites. In English today, we talk about the elites, or if we lived in a royal society, the nobles, some kind of first-class people that they think such and such a way about life, but instead it's this. This term is very prevalent in the book of Proverbs, actually. So if you ever get a chance to read it in Hebrew, you'll notice it quite frequently. Then we have, I guess I could have highlighted she too. But that's not in the above version. Shez kind of like Akkadian Shah. So Benoshel Ul or Avil Hatzair, Tzair. This one in blue, that just corresponds with Zechram. And we discussed that a little bit in the Arabic video. That's another commonality between the three languages. And then finally, Yudak, which would be he shall be crushed. This should be a hofal, actually. And so it's trying to get that passive of the causative, which, in Akkadian, we've got an end stem, but here, Hebrew, we don't. So I want to look at another example instead, since we talked about the previous code 14. I believe this is code like 258. And this corresponds with another version from Exodus. If you, were to look, I think it's Exodus 21, 5 and 6. I didn't put it here just because it's for issues of space. We have the basic, premise. Shuma wardum anabelishu ulbeli ata iktabi kima wrasu ukashuma belshu uzushu inakis. If a slave has stated to his master, "You are not my master," he shall refute his slave, and his master shall cut off his ear. Well, the modern Hebrew version of that is simply Im amor yomar eved el Adonai lo Adoni ata v'hochichu alav ki eved hu Adonav et ozno yakatses. If a slave says to his master, "You're not my master," he shall prove such about him that he is his slave, and his master shall cut off his ear. Now, using the cognates, I'm going to try and do it this way. Im Yakob eved el ba'alav al-ba'ali ata v'kon alav ki evdohu ba'alav et ozno yakatses. Now let's look at it one by one. We discussed the first word, shuma and im, already. Then let's look at this verb to say, right? In Akkadian, qabu means to say. We don't really have that in Hebrew. We have amar, which is interesting. I don't know if you notice. We'll go back real quick. And you can see in the second row where we have amor yomar, right? So the root there is amar, to say. Well, in Akkadian, amar means to see. So that might be one of those related terms at some point that we could consider. Similarly, we have this verb in Hebrew, qabab, which, or qabba, depending, I guess, on how you take the root. It looks to be a geminate root, though. That root means to curse in Hebrew. So to utter a curse is the thing. It's not so much to think a curse, but to utter a curse. And so the similar verb in Akkadian is to utter. So if a slave has stated, I wrote, and if a slave has uttered to his master, but stated, I'll just use for the English. Ul beliata. All right. Looking at the negation here, something interesting. We have ul and al. Both Hebrew and Akkadian have these two negation forms. In Akkadian, we have ul and lo. In Hebrew, we have al and lo. Now, al tends to be used with verbs and negating verbs. So Akkadian will use ul basically to negate a main clause, and la in all other situations. We see with Hebrew that al is used to negate verbs. So we have this, same but different sort of usage of the negation here. As we saw just prior in the modern Hebrew version, we would use lo. So now, okay, it's a little awkward. And instead of Adoni, well, we have this word Bel in Akkadian, which comes to us as Baal in Hebrew. That sort of means the one who is above, or in up above, right? That's your master or your lord, with a kind of lord, master, sir sort of understanding. I mean, really, in Hebrew, there's two words for lord, Adon and Baal. And most of the time, Adon is used in a positive sense, and Baal is used in a negative sense. It's not inherently negative, though. That's just kind of how it works in scriptural literature. You will see it used positive in some cases. You also see it to mean husband, right? Oh, how nice is that? Your husband's your lord and master. So you're welcome, ladies. Now, outside of that, there's some interesting things to talk about. So we have bel, but we also have the possessive suffix. You'll notice ul beliata in Akkadian above, beli, is also in Hebrew, ba'ali, my master. Then we have ata. Now, this is a bullseye, right? Ata between Akkadian and Hebrew. It's interesting because in Aramaic, you have at, or you have something written as ant, but perhaps vocalized as at. And that, that's certainly the case with Syriac, but it might also be the case with other Aramaic dialects. And in Arabic, you have anta. So instead of atta, you have anta. And really, that's what's happening with the first T, is that is an assimilated nun in both cases. But we have parity between Akkadian and Hebrew. Now, this is the verb to be, kun, as it's known in other Middle Eastern languages like Phoenician, and of course Aramaic and Arabic. Here, what's happening, if you look and you see ukashu, you're not reading the cuneiform, but the last character of the cuneiform is on, so it says ukanshu, right? But the way we normalize Akkadian is in some cases where it's written a certain way, we normalize it according to these conventions where the nun or the n sound assimilates to the following consonant. This is why you have ukashu, and of course we'll see that again shortly. Ki and kima, another these mas in Akkadian are basically enclitic mas. So we see the same sort of phenomenon here. Uzun, it says uzushu, right? And that nun or the n sound is assimilating to the sh sound. And in Hebrew, we have ozen is our word for ear. So ozno is what's written below. And again, the Akkadian actually reads uzun. So uzunshu, right? But the convention for normalizing this, given what we know about the rest of Akkadian, shows this assimilation. By the way, I'm using the Old Babylonian dialect of Akkadian. There are, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 major dialects that reflect period and region of Akkadian. Some of them may or may not be closer to some of these languages. I just like this because I'm teaching my students with the Code of Hammurabi, and it's nice for comparative purposes, especially when you have something like biblical literature that has similar phrases. And keep in mind, the Arabic's been translated into all these other Semitic languages, so it's nice, as a comparison, but it may not always be a timely comparison, right? It might be a modern thing rather than a classical or ancient thing. Finally, we have these other possibilities. For example, the Hebrew word eved for slave doesn't really correspond well with wardu or wardum. And we do see, abdu attested in Akkadian, but it looks to be a West Semitic loanword. So what's a wardum? it's hard to know what the etymology is, and maybe someone has a more studied understanding than I do. It could, I've heard various proposals. One was it goes back to waladu, right? Like boy. And we see an RL shift, and this one's productive in R. The other is it's from waradu, this verb meaning to be low or to descend. That's your Hebrew yarad, right? So notice that W to yod shift. It could be that like someone who's lower, right? And so it doesn't necessarily mean slave, but the lowest of classes, as opposed to the awilu class, perhaps. That sounds good enough for our purposes. And then nakasu, we have qasas. So maybe they're related. Sometimes the K and the Q are regional variants, and there's good phonological reasons for that. That happen in other Semitic languages. Similarly, with a regular S and an emphatic S, what we call tzadeh in Hebrew, the emphatic S. So that is a possibility. It being a first nun root, versus a geminate root is a question too. That's why I'm marking these as maybes. But you can see overall that there's a ton of commonality here, even if it's like irregularly worded, right? Same sort of thing with Arabic. It's like you can make sense of the words, but you can tell the person's not a native, or at least that's not the conventional way of conveying the language. So I did the same thing. I said, Akkadian to Arabic is kind of comparable to Latin to Italian or Spanish or French or something like that. But you know what? The more I'm realizing, this is just a big cliche. The older languages that produce a lot of textual material and textual evidence, they're going to, make a giant impact on, the local versions from the region. Whether like Hebrew's an ancient language too. Let's not forget, it's not just a modern one. All these Semitic ones are. So I think it's still a good parallel, but it's a little more intricate and complicated. And, I'm going to leave you with this little thing to show you sort of the interrelatedness between all of these languages, because they all influence one another in different ways for different reasons. And sometimes it's not always clear. It might be clearer to the researcher than it would be the student why that's the case. So there you have it, Akkadian and Hebrew cousins. And, the more Akkadian the better your Hebrew will be, to be honest. And if you have access to Akkadian language skills and to primary sources in Akkadian, your mind will be blown just how amazing it is. Thanks again for liking and sharing these videos. I really appreciate it. And, keep sending your requests, comment below, and I will see you all soon. Thank you.